Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplant Your Goodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it around me. I talk about tropical houseplants. Now today's topic is one that's been requested both on here and on my Instagram, and it's a topic of propagation. And essentially we're going back down to the basics of propagation, and I'll give you a few hints and tips that I've learned along the way that have helped me propagate quite a few plants and get them to the size that they are, and you might be able to see behind me. So one of the first things I want to talk about is preparation for your propagation. Before we even look at any plant and look at more specifics, what you need to do before you get going. And predominantly on this video, I'm going to be talking about propagation through cutting. One of the first things you want to do is prep your instruments, or prep your cutting instruments more specifically. And by that I mean if you're going to be using secateurs, if you're going to be using scissors, if you're going to be using a knife, make sure that you spray down the knife with either rubbing alcohol. Essentially you want to sterilize your instruments. So rubbing alcohol is good. Some people run things under a flame. Some people will put their whole instrument into boiling water. Be careful with any of these methods of sterilizing your instrument. Don't burn yourself essentially, but what you're doing essentially is making sure that if there's any pathogens, if there's any bacteria, any fungus that's left on the cutting instruments from the last time that you were using them, that they don't then get passed on to that open wound on both the mother plant. The mother plant is a plant that you're going to be taking the cutting from, and also the propagation cutting, so the cutting itself, because essentially you're breaking into the stem and you're exposing all of the fluids essentially, and if there's anything on your cutting instrument, it could potentially pass to both the mother plant and the cutting. Now the other thing you want to do in terms of preparation, if at all possible, because this is not something that a lot of people will necessarily think of in advance, is making sure that you have watered your plant at least a day or two before you take the cutting. It's not necessarily, I don't always do this, and I know a lot of people might just be, oh okay, I'm watering my plants, I've seen that this is maybe getting a bit too big, or I want to take the propagation, they'll just take the cut and go for it basically. Even watering the plant 1 or 2 hours before might not be enough time. And the reason why you want to do this, and this is something that I've learned along the way, if you water your plant a couple of days or 1 or 2 days beforehand, you're giving that new moisture time to absorb up through the stem, and there is more of that within the actual plant itself, which means that it's going to be within the cutting that you're going to take, because usually most people will take a top cutting or maybe some mid cuttings as well. But you're giving it enough time to actually reach all those different parts of the plant that you might be cutting, which then means that that cutting then is in a much better state. It's got a lot more of that moisture already locked into the stem before it even starts trying to root out. Because if you'd imagine, if it doesn't have any moisture within the stem and you make the cutting, one of the first things that cutting is going to have to do, again without roots as well, is try to absorb as much moisture as possible to kind of make sure that that stem that is trying to root out has got some water within it. So if you can, do remember to have watered your plant at least a day or two before you take the cutting. As I said, I don't even do this myself all the time, but the times that I have done it, I have found have been much more successful essentially. Now let me pick up a plant and I'll show you what we need to do in terms of the cutting. In front of me, I've got the Philodendron pedatum, and I'll raise it up just so you can see. I've already unfortunately taken cuttings from this, so I don't have a plant that I can cut for you today on video, but I'll make it work, don't worry. So if I bring this in a bit closer, you might be able to see there, that is essentially a node. So the place where the petiole, and the petiole is this part here, which attaches to the leaf, that then attaches to the stem. A lot of people will sometimes call this the stem. This is actually the petiole, and this is the growing stem. So the petiole is what attaches to the stem and attaches to the leaf as well. But this is a node. Essentially, it's usually where that petiole will attach to the stem. Usually you can see some aerial roots. This has got some really nice healthy aerial roots, and you might be able to see, if I bring it in a bit closer still, you might be able to see right there, that is a new growth point, because you can see I've already taken a cutting, I've already taken the top cutting from this plant, and you can see there's another growth point essentially starting from there. I'll talk a bit more again about apical dominance really briefly. Again, I've done a whole video on that if you want to go and see it in more detail. But the moment that you cut a plant, essentially you're sending a signal down to kind of say, okay, this is time for you to start branching out. So sometimes when you release the apical dominance, and the apical dominance just means that main stem is a dominant stem, so energy isn't being pushed out towards the side to start branching out. When you release that apical dominance by taking that cutting, it then signals other nodes, because each node doesn't just have the capability of growing roots, it also has the capability of growing a new growth point. So what it will then do is it will then start branching out. So if you want a bushier plant, chopping and propagating your plant on a regular basis will generally help with that, because you'll get more branches, so it will be bushier. But you can see there, and that's the node there, and if I show you a different node there, this one you can see, and the reason I want to show you the example of this, you can see all the crispy aerial roots, and that's fine. You don't need to have healthy succulent aerial roots like this. They can be crispy and dry like this. That's not a problem. It will still propagate okay for you. It will just take a bit longer. If you've got the aerial roots, generally I find it will root out a bit faster than it will if you've got the crispy aerial roots, but both of them will propagate equally well, essentially. It's just which one of them will be slightly faster. And the reason for that is on these aerial roots, a lot of the times, not on all plants I found, because some plants will essentially sacrifice the aerial roots and still just grow roots that are more accustomed to whatever media you're going to be propagating in. I'll come back onto the propagation media in a minute, but sometimes you might see this start to branch out and these aerial roots become roots, or you might actually then start seeing new roots growing from the center, from where the node is, and it will just sacrifice the aerial roots essentially. So it doesn't always necessarily matter. It's just sometimes, because I know some people ask, if I've got crispy aerial roots, can I still propagate? Yes, you can. It's still an active node. It still has the potential to push out regular roots. So don't worry about it too much. The only thing I've noticed is sometimes, as I said, this might take a bit longer to root out. The other thing that I have learned along the way is always try to take a cutting. Obviously, you'll take a cutting underneath the node, and most people will go like a few centimeters below. I usually leave a bit more, and the reason why I do this is the following. If you've got a bit more plant material there on the propagation, there is a chance with most of these propagations, especially if you're going to be propagating in water, but not exclusively, you might see that you will start getting maybe some stem rot, and that is rot going up the stem before you even start rooting out. And the thing is, if you've got a very small area of, or margin of error essentially, by only having a very small bit of plant material underneath the node itself, and that rot goes up quickly, you might end up losing the whole node. If you've got a bit more stem, I'm not talking about ridiculous amounts, but if you've got a bit more stem and you start getting some stem rot there, you can still cut it higher than the rot, and you've still got a node that could potentially root out and essentially produce another plant. So something to bear in mind, just give yourself a bit more of a margin of error by giving yourself a bit more of that stem when you're making that cutting. Now let me put this down and let's talk about a few other things past the point where you make the cut. So obviously use your sterilized instrument. There is something to be said as well about whether or not to use scissors or pruners or secateurs versus something like a knife. And this is something that I think I saw on Legend of Monstera's video, and it kind of makes sense. With a knife, there's a crushing motion. Sorry, with a scissors or secateurs or pruners, there's a crushing motion. With a knife, especially if it's not a serrated knife and it's a smooth edge knife, you'll get a much cleaner edge to the cut, both on the mother plant and on the propagation cutting. And a lot of the times that cleaner cut will generally mean there's less kind of broken cells where potentially something like rot could set in. So actually a lot of the times, if I can, and it generally isn't an option with some of the bigger plants when you need to propagate, that the only option is something like a big smooth knife basically, is I will try to go with a knife because it will generally give you a cleaner cut than anything that has got a crushing motion will do. Right, let me put this down and let's keep talking. So past the point where you've taken a cutting essentially, one of the things that a lot of people don't always do, and I found that it is very, very useful, is to let your cut propagation sit out, just out in normal air, to dry, or essentially what people call callus over. And essentially it would just mean that that cut area has enough time in those couple of hours to go a bit drier and become a bit harder, rather than it just being an exposed wound that is kind of, a lot of the times, depending on the plant, possibly even secreting some of the internal fluids from the stem. So make sure that you do this. And the reason why you want to do this is when that sap, that fluid, has dried out and it has calloused over, there's less of a chance that you might get root rot, because the internal sap of the plant isn't directly exposed to potential pathogens. It's had a bit of a chance to callus over. Some people and some sellers will do this sometimes when they're selling plants, and I know famously Kaylee Ellen did this way back before, I think when she was probably first starting the rare plant shop, where she would actually dip the cuttings from a Monstera albo into some wax, and that would seal that cut edge. It's for exactly the same reason. It's essentially to help minimize, not completely eliminate, the chance of getting stem rot. So if you can, do let it out to air dry and callus over before you add it into your media. And this brings me nicely onto media for propagation. And this is a topic that is very personal to a lot of different people. It can also be really specific to the type of plant. And by media, I mean, what are you going to put the cutting in to propagate it? One of the things that I've spoken about in a previous video recently is that a lot more people are going straight into propagating into a soil media, which is technically the way that most nurseries are probably propagating plants, and this is the way that most people have propagated for years. That's the one route, and generally speaking there, you can just take the cutting and put it into really well drained soil. It probably needs a lot of aeration, and just stay on top of the moisture, because that moisture around that cutting is basically what's going to stimulate those roots to grow out. The benefit of growing into something like a soil media, especially if you're going to eventually transfer that plant, if you were going to transfer it anyway into soil, the roots that will grow into that soil won't be disturbed. They'll already be in soil. They're used to that media. You won't have any issues. The other option that is very popular for a lot of people is just putting it straight into water. And there's a whole host of other videos that talk about things that you can do with your water. Generally, by all means, don't go and have a look at that. You can be as extra as you want to be with any of these methods, obviously. But what has worked for me is putting it into water. Generally, if I can find an opaque container, that for me makes it more realistic in terms of the environment that the roots would probably be in. So essentially, even if the roots are not used to growing in water, yes, they can grow in water, but a lot of the times roots as a whole tend to be in the soil, so it tends to be pitch black, basically, or dark. There's no light coming in. So if you've got clear containers, yes, it's interesting for you to look at the root growth, and you can still use a clear container. What I found, and again, this is personal preference because it doesn't look great. This is not a propagation vessel that you would want to maybe display in your house. This is probably something that you could have somewhere that a lot of people probably won't see it, is just wrapping that clear vessel with some tinfoil, and it will help minimize the amount of light going into those roots whilst they're rooting out in water. And generally, I find that when I've done this, it's been the most successful water propagations that I have done, and that's a method that I use to propagate a lot of my variegated monsteras in water exceptionally fast without failure ever, basically. So that is something that I swear by, at least. So that's the thing with water. And the other thing to remember with water propagation is, if you can, maybe cycle out that water, and by that I mean just dump out the water and put some new water in once every 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. Don't let it sit there. Yes, a lot of people have done this. I've done this, where the water is just sitting there for months on end, and it doesn't really cause too many issues. But the issues that it can cause is essentially what that water is doing is it's also providing oxygen to those newly growing roots. If that water is sat there for a long period of time, there's probably less oxygen that's going to be available within that water that's sat there stagnant for a very long period of time. And there's also chance, if anything is, if some of those, like what we mentioned earlier, if some of those aerial roots are basically getting sacrificed for new roots to come out of the main stem, you'll get some rot within that water. And by cycling out that water, that rot isn't essentially always in that water. It will get flushed out when you essentially cycle the water through. The other options are things like leca or perlite, or even sphagnum moss. But let's talk about leca and perlite. They work in exactly the same way. So essentially, you'd want to make sure that the leca or the perlite are sorry, leca, perlite, and pon. They're all working in the same way. Just make sure that they are saturated. And usually you'd put a little vessel of water at the bottom of whatever propagation container you've got with the leca, perlite, or pon in, and maybe a tiny bit of water at the bottom, just so there's always moisture within that environment in order for it to root out. Those types of materials are called, if I'm not mistaken, inert. So they're not biological materials, essentially, so there's less of a chance of root rot. It doesn't go away entirely, it's just less of a chance of root rot that you might get than maybe with soil or with water propagation. So that's one thing. The other way is sphagnum moss, and sphagnum moss, again, you want to dampen the sphagnum moss. You want to squeeze out as much of the water as you can, almost wring it out. And this is a bit of advice that I would have loved if somebody shared when I was starting to do this, because I used to fail a lot with sphagnum moss propagation because a lot of the times it would just rot out. You basically want to squeeze out almost to the same level that you would a kitchen, a dishwashing sponge, essentially, to that kind of level. So there's still some moisture within it, but it's not dripping wet. And that should be fine. Obviously, keep an eye on it, and you might need to re-moisten it every few days, depending on where you've got it. So that's that in terms of putting it into the media. The other thing that a lot of people don't always think about is light. And make sure that your propagations are getting the right amount of light for the type of plant that it is, basically. And I'm predominantly, I think, in this video talking about mostly iroids. So the anthuriums, the monsteras, the syngoniums, and the philodendrons, basically. But with light, just make sure that you're not giving it very, very low levels of light. It still needs some decent light level, probably not bright, bright light, because that will probably scorch the plant and stress the plant whilst it's trying to root out. But give it bright indirect light like you would normally do, maybe a bit less, just so you don't want to overload the plant. But as soon as you start seeing some of those roots coming through, maybe move it a bit closer to its traditional type of light level that you would need for that plant when it's fully rooted. So that's the thing about light. The other thing to remember is warmth, if at all possible. I know a lot of us, winter time and autumn time is the time when everybody wants to propagate because it's great. It's difficult to buy plants. The mail is too cold, all of these things. But the same thing happens for propagations. Any propagations that you do in the winter or autumn, especially if they're in a colder room, will take a bit longer. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to fail or they're not going to work. It just means that they might take a bit longer than if you think back, if you've propagated before and you've propagated in the summer and you've propagated in the winter, just remember how much faster the propagation generally tends to happen in the summer than it does in the winter. It's just that, something to remember there, that there is going to be a difference in the speed of a plant rooting out before, depending on the time of the year, basically. The other thing that people will always ask about is when to move out the propagation cutting after it's rooted into whatever the media that you're going to grow it in afterwards is. If you are going to move it out of a media, so for instance, if you're still going to grow it in leca and you propagate it in leca or pon or perlite, then just move it into the new media straight away. There might be a bit of an acclimation period if you're going from a water propagation to a soil propagation, and I think that's mainly the problematic one tends to be the water to soil propagation. And theoretically, with leca, pon, and perlite, the roots that are growing from your propagated cutting within that media is going to be a type of hybrid type of root between water roots and soil roots. So it's still going to take some adjusting if you're going to move it into soil. But the thing to remember with this is let the roots get, and I can never do inches because I'm used to the metric system, but let the roots get to at least 5, 10, maybe even 15 centimeters, and then pot them up into whatever media you're going to be using. Even better if you're seeing secondary roots come out of that main new root that has grown out, because a lot of the times, and this is something that people don't always remember, those main roots, if you think about it a bit, it's not always the case, but if you think about it a bit like a taproot, its main purpose is to stabilize that plant. Yes, it is to also get some moisture and some nutrients in, but the secondary roots that grow off that main root tend to be the ones that are really there to absorb the nutrition and to absorb the moisture more efficiently than that main thicker root, basically. So that's something to bear in mind. If you've got secondary roots, even better. And I think that's that in terms of root and potting out. A lovely little bit of information at the very end that I want to say in terms of more specifically your variegated plants or plants with very, very, very large leaves. There is going to be something that's going to be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but this is something that growers have been doing for a very long time, and you can see this a lot of times with begonias. Begonias, generally when you're propagating, in order to get it propagating faster, if it's a begonia with a huge leaf, you will see the growers cut off a large chunk of that leaf and leave only a very small amount of leaf material attached to the stem that they then propagate. This works the same with variegated plants, and it works the same with large leaf plants. If you imagine a very small stem cutting and you've got a massive leaf, or you've got a highly variegated leaf, because remember again, with a lot of the variegation that you're seeing in plants, if it's not stable, if it's an unstable bit of variegation, it generally tends to be chimeric variegation, and it tends to be genetic within the stem. So don't worry about cutting off bits of the plant that are variegated. It's in the genetics of the stem. The leaf, just imagine it, it's the expression of that genetic material from the stem. So what you would ideally want to be doing, and this might shock a lot of you, if you, for instance, and I'll use the example of the large leaves of the Monstera albo variegated, if I've got any white sections on that leaf, I will pretty much cut off all of the white section when I'm propagating that leaf and just leave the green areas, because again, remember with variegated plants, essentially, that white area isn't helping in photosynthesizing. So that still needs energy. So when it's on a plant, a variegated leaf takes up a lot of energy because it's needing to support the green part and the white part, and only the green part is contributing to that photosynthesis. Even more so if your cutting isn't necessarily attached to something that has roots anymore, that white area 9 times out of 10 will go brown and crisp off and die off. Anyway, it's sacrificing itself quite quickly, but it will generally slow down the propagation, the speed of rooting out, because it's also having to carry that white part of the leaf, that variegated white or yellow, depending on the variegation that you have, or pink if it's a pink princess. And the same thing goes for very large leaf cuttings as well. So if you've got something with a massive leaf, you probably would want to chop down to leave it to like 1/3 of that original size of that leaf, because there's so much area on that leaf that needs to be maintained by a very small bit of stem without any roots. It's just going to slow down the propagation. So yes, this also means when something is rooted out, until you start getting some new growth, you're going to be looking at a bit of a ridiculously cut leaf. But if you have such issues with it after it grows, because it will grow faster, at least it has that in my experience when I do this, just sacrifice that leaf. When you've got some new leaves, you will still have your variegation. It won't be any more or any less, but it will just be a better way for it rooting out. And I think that's everything I wanted to say. Yeah, I think I was going to say, do we talk about humidity just really quickly? In terms of humidity, if you can use something like a propagation box and you can keep the humidity high whilst the plants are propagating, that's good. It's not 100% necessary for most aroids. Granted, some of them that do like high levels of humidity will like that even more when they're propagating. And the reason why you do something like a higher level of humidity when they're propagating is because, again, it's making sure that they've got as much moisture around them as possible in order to absorb into that plant whilst it's propagating and trying to root out. But yeah, I'll wrap it up. This is already a very, very long video, but I know this is one that I tend to get a lot of questions both here and on my Instagram about all these different bits about propagation. So I thought I'd do a longer video and hopefully help some of you guys out. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. If you've got any questions and comments, as always, do drop them down below. I'd love to have that conversation. And yeah, have a great rest of your day and see you here soon. Thanks. Bye.